Yeah, good afternoon to all of you. And I was already listening to some very interesting speeches here. And it's a great pleasure to talk to you. And I'm very grateful for the government and for IGC for inviting me for this presentation. My topic is the implementation of the national determined contribution in my own country, in Germany. I will talk a little bit about our target and then where we stand with it, a proposal for a new German Climate Act, and then I will talk about the German coal phase out. Here you can see that the German mitigation policy is strongly enshrined in the EU policy. Here you can see the EU NDC, the EU targets for 2020, it is minus 20% compared to 1990. For 2030, it is at least minus 40%. And in Germany, we have adopted for 2020 emission reduction target of 40%, minus 40% in relation to 1990, and minus 55% for the year 2030. For the future, for 2050, there is currently a discussion in the EU. At the moment, the documents say minus 80 to minus 95%, but there is a current discussion to have net zero emissions in 2050. This has already been considered by the EU Council of Ministers, but at the end not adopted because some member states did not agree with it. And now, recently, our Chancellor Angela Merkel also supported that goal of climate neutrality or net zero emissions in 2050, but it is not yet enshrined in legislation or formally adopted in Germany. As being part of the EU, for Germany, like the EU system is very important. So a large part of our German emissions are covered by the European emissions trading scheme, like the emissions in the power sector and for the big industry, like steel industries, cement industries, and all the big industries. They are all part of the European emission trading scheme. And in the emission trading scheme, there is an annual cap of emissions, and this cap is reduced every year. And the pace of this reduction up to 2020 is 1.74% per year. This is equivalent to an annual reduction of 7 million tons CO2 equivalent per year. After 2020, that annual reduction is larger. It goes up to 2.2%, equivalent to this 30 million ton CO2 equivalent. More than 16 south installations in Germany are part of the, this is the total EU number, but like a substantial number of the big installations in Germany are part of the European emission trading scheme. Then we have the part of the emissions that are not covered by the European emissions trading scheme. And for this, at EU level, we have a separate regulation. This is the effort sharing regulation that covers the emission partly of industry, but of transport, buildings, the waste sector, agriculture sector, under this effort sharing regulation, each member state in the EU has its own target for these emissions, and there are also annual emission allowances with an annual compliance mechanism in the EU for each member state. And the third part we have at the EU level is the EU land use change and forestry regulation. The target in this regulation is no net emissions from this sector. So the CO2 sequestration in this sector need to be higher than the emissions in each member state. So this forms the key part of also the German NDC. Here I have a bit of a larger overview of all the targets we have. Here, these are again like the minus 5, the general greenhouse gas targets that I presented. In the Climate Action Plan 2050, the target for 2030 has been broken down to sectoral targets for the energy sector, the building sector, the transport sector, the industry sector, and to the agricultural sector. In addition, we have targets for the expansion of renewable energies. So in 2030, the target is 30% of renewable energies in gross final energy consumption and 65% of renewable energies in the electricity production. And in 2050, this should go up to 80% and 60% in gross final energy production. We have no longer like these intermediate targets, but focus now due to the EU legislation on the 2030 and the 2050 targets. But those also have annual targets and are broken down. Then we have energy efficiency targets for 2020 and 2050. We have a special situation for Germany that next to the mitigation targets, we decided to phase out nuclear power in our electricity system, and the phase out will be completed in 2022. And like this is currently on track with the nuclear phase out. And what is new, and I will explain, talk about that part more in my presentation, is that there's also now a plan to phase out coal from electricity production, which will go in steps like by 30% in 22 or 23, then to minus 60% in 2030, and a full phase out until 2038. But I will come back to those decisions and more details later in my presentation. This slide presents the emissions in the non-ETS sectors and the targets in Germany. So those that are covered by the effort sharing regulation at EU level. And like here, these are the annual allocations of emissions under that regulation, and the red dots are our current emissions. And you see that in the recent year, in particular 2017, we have been beyond our allocation, and also 2018 looks like this. So we are no longer on track here, but there's like until 2020, we may compensate that with earlier years where we have been emitting less than our budget. But these are the with measures projections, these blue dots, until 2030. And you can see our target under the effort sharing decision is minus 38%. And currently it looks like in the projections that we only reach minus 23%, and that we have a gap of 15 percentage points to meet our 2030 target. So it is pretty clear that in particular in this part of the non-ETS emission, Germany needs to adopt additional policies and measures in order to meet our targets and in order to be in line with these annual emission allocations. This is a bit the same slide. I will skip, go to the next. When you look at the entire situation in the EU has in all member states strengthened the mitigation requirements under the effort sharing decision in the non-ETS part. That leads to a situation that in this period between 2020 and 2030, many more countries will struggle with meeting the reduction targets. And there are currently only a few countries projected to be on track or above their EU targets. In this effort sharing regulation, member states can also sell their annual emission allocations to other member states, but when you take together the recent projections, there will be only rather few selling countries with rather few supply that could be sold to other member states, And when you look at the current presentation, at the current projections, there are more member states that will be in demand of buying these annual emission allocations from other member states. And the yellow bars here is Germany, the German demand. And you can see, like, the other countries would never be able to match our demand. So we really need to do something domestically to reduce further our emissions, because we will not be able to buy these amounts from other countries. And there's another big reason why also for our policymaker it is very obvious that we need to do more and to decide on additional policies and measures. Because when we would buy these annual emission allocations from other member states, it would be quite costly. This is a projection for Germany with a price of these annual emission allocations of 100 tons per 100 euros per ton CO2. This looks rather high, but other member states like Sweden have a CO2 tax of 180 euros per tons. So it would be rather surprising when they would sell these amounts to Germany for a price of 100 when their own citizens are paying much higher prices for CO2. And when you look at this price of 100 euros per ton, Germany at the end of this period, when we would not do more, would pay about 100 million euros to other member states for these annual emission allocations. And that means non-compliance with these effort-sharing targets for Germany would be really, really expensive. There would be large budget flows from Germany to other member states. So it's absolutely preferable to invest in additional measures in Germany now instead of a non-compliant situation later on. And it would be really difficult for our policymakers to explain at a later stage why we pay so large amounts to other member states instead of investing in our own future and in our own energy and transport systems. So this is very much under discussion at the moment in Germany. These numbers are floating around, so everybody is aware. And this is like how it looks at sectoral level. You can see here the transport emissions have not been decreasing but increasing, and there is a huge gap to the sectoral target for transport, so it's very urgent that we do more in the transport sector. On the building sector, the emissions have been on a downward trend, but still a big gap to the sectoral target to 2030. Also, agriculture needs to do more, and the industry sector in relation to the sectoral target. The only sector which is pretty much on track is like here, it's other, but this is mainly the waste sector. So therefore, the Ministry of Environment presented to the other ministry, to the cabinet, a new proposal for a new German Climate Act earlier this year. And it is expected that now in autumn, in September, it will be a proposal adopted by the entire cabinet, by all the ministries, and it will be then sent to Parliament now in autumn this year. The key elements of this Climate Act are that it sets a legal basis for the national mitigation targets and a new program of mitigation policies and measures. A key part is the allocation of the annual sectoral emissions until 2015 with a linear reduction pathway to all the sectors based on the sectoral targets in this Climate Action Plan 2050. And also the allocation of responsibility to achieve the sectoral targets to the sectoral ministries. So the Ministry of Agriculture would be responsible for the agricultural part, the Ministry of Transport for the transport part, including the budget responsibility in case of failure to comply with sectoral targets. Then also the allocation of responsibilities to buy annual emission allocation in case that would be necessary. And then every responsible ministry has to present an ad hoc mitigation program in case of non-compliance with sectoral targets. And at EU level, both ETS as well as non-ETS emissions have like these annual targets or allowances, and then an annual compliance mechanism. So we exactly know each year when we are non-compliant. Then there should be an expert commission to monitor the effectiveness of the implementation. There is also the target of a climate-neutral public administration until 2030, and a reporting mechanism how investments by the government institutions respect the objectives of the Paris Agreement. In parallel to the Climate Act and to the details of the Act, there is a huge discussion at the moment going on for proposals for additional policies and measures to achieve the 2030 targets in the different areas. And there's also a huge discussion on additional CO2 pricing mechanisms, at least in the transport and the building sector, which would be implemented through an increased energy tax with a redistribution of the tax amount, and some parties prefer to expand the emission trading system into sectors not included in the ETS, like transport, buildings, or agriculture. But I would say the stronger voices at the moment are more in relation to a tax system, because that can be implemented in a faster way. But we will see, like, there's a date of 20th September. The government has formed a new climate cabinet, and that will decide on this. Then I want to go to, but there's one element which has already been which has already been agreed. Germany has formed a coal commission. The exact name is Commission on Growth, Structural Change and Employment. The Commission has been tasked to elaborate a plan for the reduction phase out of coal in the electricity generation, and create a concrete perspective for the economy in the coal regions, and implement a sectoral target in the energy sector. The background of this is the renewables have been growing in Germany. The electricity production from renewables is on track. But at the same time, coal generation did not reduce, so our emissions did not reduce, and we started to export more electricity to our neighboring countries. The German coal fleet at the moment represents still a significant share in power generation of 36%, and the coal phase out runs in parallel to the final phase out of nuclear phase out. And the lignite industry in Germany still employs about 20,000 employees, and indirectly an additional 20,000. So it's quite a challenge for my country. So we formed this coal commission. It has been composed by representatives from industry, from environmental NGOs, from science, from politics. So altogether about like 30 representatives. And this is what they achieved at the end in form of compromise, so that we will decrease our coal capacity by, by 30% until 2023, by 37% until 2025, by 60% until 2030, and a complete phase out until 2038. Many experts say it will be earlier due to the CO2 prices in the ETS and the economics of the coal sector. It will likely be at least 2035. This will bring down our emissions in the energy sector from 330 million tons CO2 to about 170 million tons CO2, and we would achieve our sectoral targets in the energy sector, and that would be a very substantial contribution. Here you can see how that works out in the total electricity generation. This is a picture since 1950, so we have increased our coal consumption, then our nuclear. Now we are phasing out nuclear almost in the same speed as it has come in the historic past. Goes out then until 2050. We also need to phase out gas and oil. And then we have this huge challenge to expand renewables in this large way in Germany. So the most closest target for the renewables is the 65% of electricity generation in 2030. How is this phase out done? There will be negotiations with the operators, the plant operators, on compensation. If they agree with the government until June 2020, the outcome will be fixed in legislation. If there is no agreement, there will be a mandatory decommissioning with compensation only if legally required. And there are some lawyers that say on a legal basis in the German legislation we do not need to have any compensation. So it's quite good for the operator when they come to an agreement with the government before that date. Then we need to still fix some parts of the renewable expansion in the Renewable Energy Act, which works through tender volumes in a renewable auctioning scheme at the moment. Then we also have to further implement measures for our electricity network development plan and legislation, and also the infrastructure construction, because the renewable electricity will be produced in different places than the current coal power plants. And then we need to cancel the related ETS emission allowances equivalent to these coal emissions in the EU ETS, and that also these cancellation volumes need to be fixed, and some provisions in the legislation in relation to that as well. And then there will be a support program for the structural changes in the coal regions, like infrastructure support, investment support, innovation support. There will be government agencies and military parts moved to those areas. There will be an early retirement scheme and labor market policies in these areas. Altogether, it will be about 2 billion annually spent for the next 20 years on specific structural measures in the coal mining regions, but these funds will only be partial additional. And the Commission came to this result with 27 votes out of 28. The result is a compromise, not a consensus. It has been painful for the environmental NGOs, but also, of course, for the coal industry and for the policymakers. So this is like the ingredient of a good compromise, that everybody needs to give something into that compromise. The 2030 emission reduction target in the energy sector can be reached with that proposal. Now we have to focus on the implementation process, the legislative process in the government. Part of this is already moving. Some say it is a very expensive deal, but when you see in these 20 years we will spend about an additional 40 billion euros on 1 billion ton CO2 mitigation, which would be 40 euros per ton CO2, which in my view is not that high as an expense for that coal compromise. And with this coal phase out, Germany is very much within the context of other European countries like France and Sweden phased out coal in 2022, Austria, Ireland, Italy, UK in 25, and they will phase out coal. Finland and Netherlands in 2029, then 2030 Denmark and Portugal, and for Germany it's now in this period 2035 and 2038, and only very few countries will be left using coal then in Europe, which will also then strengthen the EU NDC implementation. With that, I'm at the end of my presentation. I thank you very much for listening. I have not focused so much on the other sectors because there is so much under discussion, but not a very clear proposal that will come only in September. This conference is a bit too early for the exact proposals for transport or agriculture sector. Therefore, I focused on the coal part, which has now already been agreed with this compromise. Thank you very much for your attention.